The Franco-Prussian War is one of the most interesting and underrated conflicts in history. In the conflict, we see machine guns, bolt-action rifles, and breech-loaded artillery cannons. As well, we see a lot of the tactics that were used to justify the bloody assaults across no man's land that were attempted in World War I over and over. That is why, to me, it is a much closer comparison to World War I than the American Civil War, which often gets called the first modern war and compared to the Great War. To cap it off, at the end of this war, we see the creation of Germany and the destruction of the Second French Empire. In the peace treaty that ended the war, it led to simmering friction and a dramatically altered great power dynamic in Europe, which would start the continent down a path that would ultimately end in the Great War. So let's go into everything you could possibly want to know about this legendary conflict between Prussia and its German allies against France. Before we go into the actual fighting, we must first examine how the war started. For this, I'm not going to go into extreme detail about how these two nations got to this point. I have a whole nother video on my channel, so if you want to learn more about why the war started, go watch that. Instead, for this summary, I will be focusing on the 1860s and how events in that decade led these two nations into conflict. We are going to begin in July of 1866. At this point, Prussian General Moltke had just crushed the Austrian army in the Battle of Conquest. This is the Austro-Prussian War. In only 3 weeks of fighting, Moltke has encircled Prague and soundly defeated the Austrians. This dramatically changes the landscape of Europe. In the armistice to end that war, Austria agrees to surrender its authority over the German lands to Prussia. The Austrian Emperor had been the president of the German Confederation since the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And just like that, 50 years of Austrian rule in the German lands has been handed over. The Prime Minister of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, immediately gets to work reshuffling Germany, abolishing the 39-state German Confederation and annexing most of the northern members. He then packed the rest of the northern German states into a northern German Confederation, with Berlin controlling its foreign policy and military affairs, which essentially made them Prussian territory. The only 3 major German states left with a level of independence were Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden. They were next on Bismarck's mind to incorporate into a fully unified German state. The country most alarmed by this new German setup was France. At this point, France is ruled by Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis became president of the Second Republic in 1848, after revolts overthrew the monarchy. Napoleon III, as he was called, had become popular by promising to return France to glory, like the days of his uncle, and ultimately to make France a world power once again. Napoleon then became emperor for life after he led a coup in 1851 that ended the Second Republic and started the Second Empire. Under Napoleon, France did achieve notable success. They were victorious with Great Britain over Russia in the Crimean War of 1854-56, then again won another great victory over Austria in 1859 to aid in the unification of Italy. However, in the 1860s, France's prestige and influence started to wane. First, in 1861, France tried to extend their influence into North America by invading Mexico. They were joined by Spain and Great Britain in this intervention. The official reason the 3 states invaded was to collect on unpaid debts. Napoleon went one step further, though, attempting to install Archduke Maximilian of Austria as Emperor of Mexico. Maximilian was eventually executed, and the French army was forced to abandon the Mexican occupation in 1867. More concerning to France and Napoleon, though, was the sudden rise of Prussia's power after the Austro-Prussian War. Because that war resulted in Prussia's dominance in the German lands, France now had a formidable foe in an area that was traditionally where France exercised a lot of influence. To showcase how strong Prussia had become, here are some numbers. In 1860, Prussia had just half the population of France. But after Prussia's victory over Austria, that population number shifted increasingly closer. Prussia now had 30 million people to France's 38 million people. However, in military terms, Prussia was larger. They had universal conscription, which basically meant that every able-bodied man was required to join the military for a certain period of time, which made their army 1/3 larger than France's. Prussia could get even larger and more powerful still if they added the 3 southern German states of Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden. For starters, if Prussia was able to combine with those 3 southern German states, that would add an additional 200,000 well-trained troops and 8 million people to their state. Plus, those lands would give Prussia the ability to invade France on a broad front. And so Napoleon became determined to resist any enlargement to Prussia's territory, or any collaboration between Prussia and the 3 major southern German states. Bismarck knew this, but he also knew that the best way to get the people of the German lands to put aside their differences and unite was through a war. In particular, a war with an outside aggressive power. Bismarck was determined to entice France to act aggressively and declare a war on the German states, which would bring about total unification of Germany. Prussia wasn't the only one thinking a war could bring unity. Napoleon had grown unpopular since he took over as emperor, and the calls for a more republican-styled government had grown louder, especially as Louis's health started to decline in the 1860s. Napoleon III reasoned that a war against the Prussian enemy on their doorstep would unify the French people, give him a great victory to re-solidify his regime, and provide the perfect excuse to crush his Republican opposition in the name of a national emergency during the war. Tensions between Prussia and France rose until in 1870, when a succession crisis in Spain would spark the outbreak of war. Spain needed a new royal ruling family, since they had ousted the Bourbons, and they looked to the Prussian King Wilhelm's nephew, Leopold, to fill that void. Bismarck urged Leopold to accept, knowing it would anger the French. And then Leopold did. Napoleon and his foreign minister, Gramont, took the bait and reacted angrily. Even after Leopold withdrew from consideration for the Spanish throne, France then demanded King Wilhelm sign and publish a document pledging that Prussia would never again offer any candidates to the Spanish throne. This was something meant to humiliate the Prussian king, since such a demand could not ever be realistically accepted. King Wilhelm told his minister to respond to that demand by canceling the meeting with the French ambassador, because confirmation had already been received of Prince Leopold's withdrawal. However, Bismarck intervened, changing the message to have it portray the king rudely canceling the meeting without any explanation. France and Napoleon took offense to that response, and used Wilhelm's rude response as justification for war, declaring war on Prussia. France declaring war first was critical to Bismarck, because the Prussian alliance with the 3 southern states of Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden only required them to join Prussia in a war in defense of Germany. Because Napoleon's France had declared war first, and for what many believed was a minor incident, France did indeed look like the aggressor, and the German states did look to be under threat. And so those 3 states enthusiastically joined the side of Prussia. War would officially begin on July 19th, 1870. Going into the war, these 2 armies were at wildly different ends of the military proficiency spectrum. At this time, Prussia had probably the most professional army in the world. As well, the German states that were added to create the Northern German Confederation were seamlessly integrated into the Prussian military structure, creating a truly formidable force. France's army, on the other hand, was hitting the point of decay from years of mismanagement. So let's dig a little deeper into this. Like I said earlier, Prussia's universal conscription gave them a deep and powerful pool of military men to draw from. They required 3 years of military service from every able-bodied 20-year-old man. Then once completed, they transitioned into the Army Reserves for another 4-year stint. And then after that, it was required to do another 5 years in the Landwehr, or National Guard. A fully mobilized Prussian army could amass over 1 million men. In comparison, France, who did not have universal conscription, could only put together a force of 400,000 men. Instead of universal conscription, France preferred long-term service, professional soldiers. Men signed into 7-year-long enlistment hitches, with bonuses for re-enlistment. These two systems led the French and Prussian armies to have vastly different makeups. 50% of the French army in 1870 had served between 7 to 21 years. The Prussian army, on the other hand, was much greener and more amateur. For this conflict, the initial stage would be absolutely pivotal to the French. Their standing army outnumbered Prussia's 400,000 to 300,000. So, if France could get that larger, more experienced army on the offensive quickly, they could achieve success. But if France couldn't win a quick victory, the 900,000 reserves and National Guard at Prussia's disposal would bury the French. France under Napoleon did try to create their own National Guard type system like the Prussians had, but it wasn't efficient or effective like the Prussian model when war broke out in 1870. French generals actually downplayed that manpower advantage though. Instead, they focused on their soldiers' wealth of experience, gained from conflicts in the Crimean War, the Italian War of Unification, and the Mexican Campaign. The French soldiers' long experience in the military did have a drawback though. It left them jaded and cynical, less inclined to take risks, while the younger Prussian soldiers would enter the war full of youth and energy for their cause, energetically putting their bodies in harm's way. The French soldiers were considered excellent shots though, and that would lead to some devastating casualty numbers for the Prussian assaults. Although, for all their soldiers' experience on the battlefield, the French generals did not have much recent experience in large-scale warfare against an elite enemy. Both the Crimean and Italian wars were over a decade ago, and the Mexican campaign was more of an occupation involving small-scale encounters. Prussian generals like Moltke had just fought Austria 4 years ago and Denmark 6 years ago in traditional large-scale warfare. It wasn't just a lack of large-scale experience that hurt the French generals, though. During Napoleon's reign, he favored promotion of officers through loyalty and seniority, which led to a slow advancement process, and kept competent officers stuck below older and ineffective officers. Moltke, on the other hand, regularly sacked generals who were ineffective, which raises another key difference. Helmuth von Moltke was Prussia's chief of the German general staff, basically the head of the Prussian army. France didn't even have that position. Instead, Napoleon III simply just communicated what he wanted the army to do through two different people. One was his military chief of staff Lebrun, and the other was his war minister Marshal Ney, who was later replaced by Lebeuf. The reason this was extra problematic is that France entered the war without a concrete war plan. They had a rough plan, and that was to create 3 armies, one near Lorraine led by Bazaine, the second near Strasbourg under MacMahon, and a third in reserve near Chalon. From there, Napoleon was expecting to invade the southern German states, with the goal of separating the southern German states from the northern ones. As part of this plan, Napoleon expected Austria would then join on their side and attack Prussia from the east. Italy was also expected to join in on the French side, which ironically would have meant Austria allowing Italian troops to pass through their territory, which was definitely unlikely. Denmark was the third and final country that Napoleon's France expected to actively side with the French during this war. However, these were just assumptions and never fully solidified. Napoleon and his foreign minister Gramont had never actually solidified alliances with those 3 nations, which would have required them to join the French side in the event of a war with Prussia. And then, interestingly, on the verge of war, Napoleon then scrapped his vague 3-army plan, announcing that there would be just one army of the Rhine, and it would be solely under his command. By doing this, he hoped to create a more controllable and flexible army to advance rapidly. But this large army would have been well beyond the capabilities of even the most ingenious of military commanders, which at this point in his career was something Napoleon was definitely not. Prussia, on the other hand, planned meticulously for this war. Mobilizing quickly and striking the enemy fast were the main reasons why Moltke's armies won against Denmark and Austria. He and his staff planned the mobilization and concentration of the Prussian army down to the last detail. Once the forces were gathered in southern Germany, he would use 3 armies to invade France. The first and second armies together would threaten Lorraine and Metz. The second army would actually be the biggest force of the 3 with 134,000 men, while the first army would be the smallest at 50,000 men. Then to the south, the third army would have 125,000 men and be led by King Wilhelm's son, the Crown Prince Frederick Wilhelm. They would be positioned to threaten south, to threaten Alsace and Strasbourg. Moltke then left 7 divisions in reserve. 1 would protect the west coast in case of a French invasion, and the other 6 as to not overload the rail system. Moltke's forces were perfectly situated for flexibility. They could either advance into France or hold off a French invasion. If the French forces decided to advance into southern Germany, the Prussian Third Army was positioned to hit its flank. However, if the French army went straight into the Rhinish-Palatinate, the Second Army could block that advance, and the First Army could hit the flank. Then, in the Prussian invasion of France scenario, First Army could be in the immediate vicinity to support Second Army's right flank, while the Third Army was positioned to support the left. The Prussians had masterfully set their forces up in a mutually supporting arc, while France had positioned their army on an extremely narrow front, from Metz to Saarbrücken. In this war, France's path to victory would rely on getting their large professional army to quickly invade southern Germany and separate those southern German states from the rest of the northern German Confederation. Quick victories by the French would then convince the other powers like Austria and Denmark to join in on the French side, which would then threaten Prussia with armies on 3 different fronts. On the Prussian side, Moltke's goal was simple but effective. He was looking to destroy the primary French army of the Rhine. He knew the longer the war went on, the more likely it was that another power may try to intervene. Another worry of Moltke was the risk of a partial victory in the early stages of the war, because that would give the French army the ability to regather itself in the interior of France, which would dangerously stretch the Prussian logistic lines as they chased after those French forces. And so, the only way to ensure a complete victory was by crushing the French army early, when both forces were near the border. Now, I want to add some context so you can fully understand what warfare was like in 1870. By that time, technology in warfare was at a crossroads. On the one hand, you have plenty of modern tech that could be compared to World War I, like bolt-action rifles, machine guns, and breech-loaded artillery guns. However, the tactics and style of warfare still resembled the Napoleonic years. Let's take a closer look at the 2 armies and how they use these new technologies to design their tactics going into the conflict. Infantry warfare had been fundamentally changed forever in the Austro-Prussian War. In that conflict, the Prussians were equipped with the breech-loaded needle rifle, while the Austrians were still using a muzzle-loaded rifle. The Prussians could fire 4 to 5 times faster than the Austrians, which absolutely devastated every Austrian attack. During the war, the Austrians had utilized shock tactics for their offensives, which were massed, battalion-sized columns that looked to rush and break the enemy lines. That style of warfare dated back to the Napoleonic era, and was still the prevailing standard for infantry attacks. France's victory over Austria in 1859 had reinforced shock tactics as an effective strategy. The French had used massed 600-man battalion-sized attacks to defeat the Austrian army. However, the rate of fire of the needle gun made those type of massed attacks outdated. France embraced technological advancement. After seeing the effectiveness of the breech-loaded needle rifle, Napoleon tasked his Minister of War, Nel, with acquiring a modern, breech-loaded rifle for the French army. Antoine Chassepots and a team of French engineers excitedly took on that project, creating a breech-loaded rifle nicknamed the Chassepots. It was brought into service in late 1867. The Chassepots completely outclassed the Prussian needle rifle, which was introduced 25 years ago and now, by the time of the Franco-Prussian War, was outdated. The needle rifle had an effective range of 400 to 600 yards, while the Chassepots was effective all the way up to 1,000 to 1,500 yards. The Chassepots was also lighter and could fire 8 to 15 rounds a minute, while the needle rifle, loaded with a clunky bolt action, could only manage 4 to 5 rounds a minute. Chassepots bullets also had an advantage. They were smaller and more powerfully charged than the needle rifles, which meant that the Chassepots had more penetrating power. The most frightening thing about the Chassepots' penetrating power was that the entry and exit wounds were far different. The entry one was about the same size as the bullet, while the exit wound was 7 to 13 times larger. The Chassepots had elite stopping power, while the needle rifle, on the other hand, had a design flaw that led to a lot of its thrust to be lost in a leaky breech. That caused many of the wounds caused by the needle rifle to be light. Another factor to showcase how much more effective the Chassepots was over the needle rifle is with regards to bullet caliber. The Chassepots bullet was 11 millimeters, compared with the needle rifle's 14 millimeters. That meant French infantry had the ability to carry more ammunition. French soldiers could carry 105 rounds in their pouches, while Prussian soldiers could fit no more than 70. As well, French riflemen would not be affected by the plume of sparks and grease that burst from their breech, like what happened each time the needle rifle was fired. The Chassepots breech was sealed with a rubber ring, which limited the smoke. The French didn't just have an amazing rifle though. They also had one of the world's first machine guns, the mitrailleuse. It was a lot like the American Gatling gun in its design, basically a revolver cannon, with 37 gun tubes rotating by hand crank. Once the last tube was fired, the gun crew ejected the spent cartridge and then slid a new box of reloads into the breech. The mitrailleuse could rattle off 4 to 5 37-round magazines every 60 seconds, which amounts to roughly 100 to 200 rounds per minute. The maximum effective range for this innovative weapon was about 1,300 yards. The issue with the gun was that it could not swivel or move. Basically, it could shoot in a straight line from its position, which definitely hurt the mitrailleuse's flexibility when defending against an attack. With these two world-class weapons, the French could have devised very ingenious tactics to break the Prussian lines. However, that is not the direction they went. Instead, French generals favored the defensive. They would rely on packing their men into narrow, prepared defensive positions. They hoped that those defensive positions, anchored by the Chassepots rifle and the mitrailleuse machine gun, could mow down wave after wave of Prussian assaults. The Prussians were much more mobile and active in comparison. Moltke permitted orderly decentralization on the battlefield. He wanted his forces to spread out and attack on a broad front, breaking from the traditional line and column approach on the battlefield, focusing on probing at the enemy weak points and flanks. Once a weak point was found, or the enemy's flank was turned, those small unit attacks could turn a leak into a flood and win the battle decisively. The Prussian small force fragmentation approach bewildered the Austrians in 1866. The French analyzed these Prussian small-scale attacks, and they hated the chaos of them. These smaller, weaker units all attacking in different spots across the front seemed haphazard in their opinion, and they believed a well-timed counterattack could obliterate the small, isolated units. However, what looked like chaos to the French was actually a thoughtful approach by the Prussians. Before an engagement, Prussian troop commanders would be briefed on the aims of the battle, and so each commander may have been approaching the objective in a different way, but they were all working towards the same goal. The Prussians also deeply valued maps, making sure even battalion and company commanders had access to them. The French, on the other hand, were severely lacking in maps. The French army and decentralization were not two words that would have been used together in 1870. French commanders wanted total control over their battalions. They were so obsessed with control that their infantrymen were still not even allowed to fire on their own. Instead, they had to wait for the signal from their commanding officer, and once it was given, they could fire, but not all at once. Instead, it was successively, so starting with the left, rolling down to the right. Skirmishers is another area to showcase just how much value French commanders placed on direct control. French skirmishers were kept by the main body of the infantry and kept on a tight leash. Prussian skirmishers, though, would push far in advance of the main force in order to make contact with the enemy, throw him off balance, and then find his flanks. France had adapted their warfare style to that of the Algerians, shooting from a distance rather than moving in close with the bayonet. Shooting from a distance and not rushing the enemy would also keep soldiers close to their commanders, which is why the French commanders preferred it. They wanted to tightly pack their forces together to devastate the enemy from a distance. In fact, in 1870, the French army's smallest maneuver formation was still a battalion, which was roughly 800 men. The Prussians, on the other hand, since they valued small-scale attacks, maneuvered in 250-man companies, and often subdivided even further to only platoon-sized attacks, which could be anywhere from 20 to 100 men. Now, you might be wondering, these French tactics make sense though. They have this fast-firing rifle and a rapid-firing machine gun, so why not just sit on the defensive while the enemy rushes into your wall of bullets, like a lot of people talk about happened in World War I? Well, the main reason why this style of static defensive strategy would struggle is because of Moltke's approach to counter it. Moltke subscribed to the school of the war of movement and maneuverability. He wasn't just recklessly charging his troops into French defensive lines. He would prefer to fight on a wide front, maximizing confusion for the defenders. By valuing smaller scale unit attacks and probing all along the French lines, this style of offensive would spread out the attack all across the French defensive lines, which gave the Prussian units the ability to outposition those static French forces by hitting their flanks and probing for openings in the line. That was the greatest difference between these two forces on the field. The Prussians were willing to move on the battlefield, while French forces preferred to stay together in massed battalions on the defensive. Prussia had been practicing for this war since their victory over Austria in 1866. Moltke and his generals knew the French preferred the defensive, and so they resolved to never attack the strong points of the French defenses with any formations that were larger than a company of 250 men. As well, Prussian battalions worked exceedingly hard to practice transitioning from march columns to company columns in order to quickly gather in their attack formations. This all doesn't mean that the Prussian approach was flawless. It still relied on closing what was called the chassepot gap. That rifle could hit targets up to 1,200 yards, and so the Prussian infantry attack would have to close that gap as quickly as possible before all the momentum was destroyed in a barrage of bullets. Why didn't the Prussians update their needle rifle? After all, it was 25 years old. Well, that's because Moltke and the Prussian military leaders had invested heavily in new artillery. During the Austro-Prussian War, their outdated smoothbore cannons had performed horribly, while the Austrian cannons were the lone bright spot for their army in the war. So by 1870, the Prussians now relied on the new and cutting-edge breech-loaded steel Krupp cannon, which could fire more quickly, accurately, and further than the French's 10-year-old bronze guns. Those French guns had been state-of-the-art in 1859, but by the Franco-Prussian War, they were totally obsolete. The cannons of the two sides deserve more context to showcase how much more effective that Krupp gun was. First, like I said, the Prussian Krupp guns were breech-loaded, which simply means that the ordnance was loaded in the rear of the gun's barrel, while the French artillery was still muzzle-loaded, so that ordnance was loaded through the front of the barrel, obviously. The big difference is that breech-loaded is a much faster way to reload a cannon. Caliber is another big difference. At that time, guns were described by the weight of the projectile they fired. The heavier the projectile, the more destructive power the cannon delivered. The heavy French gun at the time was a 12-pounder, so it fired a 12-pound projectile. Makes sense, right? While the heavy Prussian gun, on the other hand, was a 24-pounder, and so it obviously fired a much heavier projectile. That gave the Prussian guns a huge advantage in destructive power. Overall, the Krupp guns completely outclassed their French counterparts in basically everything that mattered. The Krupp gun had a superior rate of fire, range, accuracy, and ordnance when compared to the French 12-pounder. To drive it home even further with more specific details of that edge, the Krupp gun had 3 times the accuracy, twice the rate of fire, and a third greater range. Plus, Prussian cannon blasts were packed with more destructive capability. Also, French guns had to be charged with an unreliable time-fused shell that could only burst in 2 possible zones, a short one of 1,300 yards and a long one of 2,500 yards. That meant that anyone outside of those 2 zones was safe. As you can see, in artillery guns, there was a huge mismatch in favor of the Prussians. Basically, the Prussians could hit the French defensive lines from out of sight range quickly, accurately, and with a massive blast, while the French had no way to counter that with their own artillery. Okay, now let's talk about how artillery was used in this era. At this time in military history, there was a resurgence towards Napoleonic-era artillery batteries. Napoleon had been famous for pushing his cannons into the line of battle to help his infantry by opening breaches in the enemy lines that infantry could then exploit. The risk of this approach is that your guns can become vulnerable to rifle attack. And without enough guns in reserve, if your infantry attack fails, nothing will be able to hold back the enemy counterattack from sweeping you completely off the field. Napoleon had mitigated this problem by keeping a grand battery of guns in reserve. The French army of 1870 preferred that grand battery approach, which they successfully used to defeat the Austrians in 1859. Moltke, on the other hand, wanted to innovate. He was looking for a golden middle between massed grand batteries and dispersal of guns on the battlefield to work closely with the infantry. What Moltke and the Prussians came up with was a move away from great batteries and toward massed batteries. The difference is this: great batteries are a static line of guns pulled together from various units in order to smash an enemy attack or shatter his defense before an offensive. An example of this is in the American Civil War, in the Battle of Gettysburg. In that battle, General Lee of the Confederate Army brought all of his artillery together on the 3rd day to shell the Union lines before the famous Pickett's charge. The weakness of this great battery approach was its immobility. Once they had repulsed an attack or opened a breach in the enemy lines, they could only be moved with very time-consuming difficulty. Artillery masses, on the other hand, are much more dynamic in comparison. They were independent batteries of guns that were massed where needed, pouring in cannon blasts, then moving on to mass somewhere else. This kind of approach seemed deranged at the time, since it risked the artillery might go in the wrong direction and leave the infantry exposed. However, much like how all the infantry units had the same objectives, so too did the artillery units. And so everyone in the Prussian army knew the main point they were supposed to be working towards. As well, Prussian artillery guns had a good habit of sticking closely with the infantry, which helped shorten the ranges and improve their accuracy. That mobility of fire would prove deadly in the Franco-Prussian War, and severely undercut the advantages of the chassepot. Some have even theorized, like me, that the Krupp gun was one of the most decisive weapons of war ever created. The last important part about warfare in 1870 I want to cover is cavalry. Cavalry in the Napoleonic era had a much more glamorous aura about it. Light cavalry would screen, scout, and raid the enemy lines, while heavy cavalry would be used in massed attacks at the end of the battle to run down a weary and disorganized enemy. However, with improvements to rifles and artillery, the use of heavy cavalry in attacks became incredibly risky. The fate of Lord Cardigan's Light Brigade during the Crimean War was a bloody example of what modernizing war could do to a massed cavalry attack. In that assault, 2/3 of the 670 heavy cavalrymen who charged the Russian lines were killed, wounded, or blown off their horses. The Prussians actually had their own feudal heavy cavalry charge during the Austro-Prussian War. The assault lost 30% of its strength due to long-range rifle and cannon fire before it eventually panicked and dissolved out. After that war, Moltke looked to reshape his cavalry. He would lighten his cavalry units, and instead of deploying cavalry in great masses, like how the heavy cavalry had traditionally operated, he would deploy these light cavalry units everywhere, spreading them out as much as possible to achieve different goals. That meant that the primary goals of the Prussian cavalry were slightly altered. One of their primary goals would be scouting. They were to keep track of where the forces of the enemy were moving, and then relay that info back to the Prussian High Command. As well, they would screen their own army's movements so that the French forces would be blind to Prussian movements. Another key area they would focus on is supplies and logistics. They would protect the Prussian supply lines from any kind of French cavalry raids. As well, they would operate well behind the French main line to cause as much damage as possible to their supply lines. Prussian cavalry would fan out across 30 to 40 miles, and then continue to subdivide from there, maintaining self-reliance and a constant feeling of harassment on the enemy, while also providing a constant stream of information for their own high command to make decisions off of. The French, on the other hand, had not adapted their cavalry. They entered the Franco-Prussian War with massed and elegantly uniformed heavy cavalry units. Whereas the Prussians had downsized their heavy cavalry to just 8 regiments, the French still had 12. And the French would have had even more, but budgetary reasons had forced them to downsize some of their heavy cavalry units before the war. What innovations the French cavalry did make were in the opposite direction of military trends. Instead of lighter, more mobile cavalry, like the Prussians focused on, the French cavalry actually got heavier. They went out and bought thicker armor for their heavy cavalry units. They were stubbornly going to attempt to use their heavy cavalry to ride through a firestorm of modern weaponry. French cavalry would spend very little resources or training on the key aspects of screening and scouting, which would lead to devastating results for their forces in the Franco-Prussian War. When Prussia and France went to war in 1870, what did the other powers think about it? Well, that's what I'm going to cover now. In the lead up to this war, Bismarck did a brilliant job of diplomacy, making sure no other powers aligned with France and interfered. He had successfully done this before in the Austro-Prussian War, preventing any major powers from siding with Austria, and even was able to entice Italy to join Prussia's side during the war. Let's start with the largest power in the world at that time, Great Britain. Since the horrors of the Crimean War in 1854-56, Great Britain had maintained a policy of neutrality and non-intervention in Europe. As well, the Queen at the time, Victoria, had always maintained an interest in the German states. Her daughter, also named Victoria, was actually married to Crown Prince Frederick III of Prussia. Ultimately, what the British government mainly cared about was just keeping the conflict out of Belgium. Belgium was always of keen interest for British security reasons, and that's why they got Prussia and France to sign deals guaranteeing the neutrality of Belgium for the conflict. France would buy arms through British suppliers throughout the conflict though, which the British cabinet did not prohibit. That very much angered Prussia. But Great Britain also aided Prussia. At the start of the war, France attempted a blockade of Prussian ports, but France was concerned about angering Great Britain if they turned away British vessels, and so ships flying a British flag were allowed through, which effectively made the blockade useless. Next, let's move on to the expected ally France was most relying on, Austria-Hungary. Austria had transformed into a dual monarchy after their loss to Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War. That defeat was the main reason Napoleon and his foreign minister Gramont thought the Austrians would side with the French in a war with Prussia, so they could have their revenge on their German rivals. What the French leadership didn't appreciate enough was just how destabilizing for Austria that defeat was. The nation was militarily weak and internally divided. That made Austria-Hungary reluctant to join a war so soon after their emphatic defeat at the hands of the Prussians only 4 years ago. As well, the Austrians weren't exactly the biggest fans of France either, since Napoleon's France had sided with Piedmont Sardinia in 1859, in the war that led to Italy's unification. More recently though, the Austrian foreign minister found that France's declaration of war on Prussia was too presumptuous. The Austrian king, Franz Joseph, did favor sending aid to France in the war, but the Hungarian side of the dual monarchy wanted nothing to do with the war. So that rift led Austria-Hungary to stay out of the conflict. Austrian leaders would watch the events of the war closely, and would be inclined to join France's side if they appeared confidently to be the winning side. At this point, Austria just couldn't afford to be on the losing side of another war, like their losses in 1859 and 1866. What about Italy? After all, they owed their independence to France and Napoleon III, so they seemed like a natural ally, right? Well, no. Italy had drifted out of France's orbit relatively quickly after 1859. For starters, in 1860, France annexed Nice and Savoy, which deeply angered Italy. Also, French soldiers were currently stationed in Rome to protect the Pope's independence from the larger state of Italy. The final reason Italy wasn't inclined to join France is that they had actually gotten closer to Prussia. Italy had joined sides with Prussia in the war in 1866 and helped them to defeat Austria. So the best Italy would offer to France in this conflict was lukewarm support. Denmark was the third country that France was actively counting on to join on their side during the war. Denmark did have some interest in joining France, hoping to regain Schleswig and Holstein, which were the two territories that Denmark lost because of their war with Prussia. But Great Britain and Russia both pressured the Danes to stay out of the conflict. Because of that, Denmark looked to sit on the sidelines, only to hop into the action if France achieved early success and looked to be the winning side. Next up is the manufacturing superpower, the United States. What did the US think of this conflict, and whose side did they lean to? American public opinion favored the German states. The United States had a large German population who had immigrated in the mid-1800s. More important than that connection, though, was how deeply unpopular Napoleon III was in America. The emperor stood for dynasty over democracy. That resentment started because Napoleon had destroyed the Second Republic of France. Prussia was also a monarchy, though, and so they should have been a tough ideological fit for American public opinion, right? To be honest, most Americans at this time just didn't know much about the political makeup of Prussia. To top it all off, though, the single greatest negative factor against France and Napoleon III in the eyes of the American people was their approach to the Civil War. Throughout the American Civil War, French leadership was sympathetic to the Confederates. By contrast, Prussian leaders like Bismarck and King Wilhelm had sent telegrams of congratulations after victories to the North during the war. Even worse than appearing sympathetic to the Confederate side, Napoleon had tried to take advantage of the American turmoil by installing his own puppet government in Mexico. Even though the Mexican campaign failed, and failed miserably, many Americans, like President Grant, had not forgotten that move. More than anything, though, President Grant hoped the war would stimulate the American economy by driving up the cost of labor and manufacturing in Europe, giving the US a competitive edge. The United States would export weapons to France throughout the conflict, but most were outdated rifles. The last major power I want to focus on is Russia. Tsar Alexander II steered a policy of neutrality throughout. Russia was still trying to modernize its military and economy after the rough defeat of the Crimean War, and so entering a European war was just out of the question at this point, especially to join the side of a power like France, who had just fought against it in that Crimean War, and who had supported the recreation of an independent Polish state, which would have carved territory out of Russia. Instead, Russia would look to take advantage of this war. Because France would be distracted during it, they could attempt to alter some of the terms of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Crimean War. Mainly, Russia was looking to remilitarize the Black Sea region by fortifying Sevastopol and bringing back the Black Sea Squadron. Both of those things had been forbidden as part of the treaty to end that war. On to the mobilization stage of the war. Now, normally when covering a conflict, I would only make a brief mention of how the two sides mobilized their forces. But for the Franco-Prussian War, mobilization was a pivotal aspect of the war. As I mentioned earlier, the French had the larger standing army of 400,000 to 300,000. But Prussia had the much larger reserve force, with the ability to augment that 300,000 with up to 1 million men. That is why it was imperative that the French mobilize their professional army quickly to launch their invasion into the southern German states, because the longer it took them to gather their forces, the more the weight of the Prussian reserves would come into effect. At the beginning stage of a war, when the armies for both sides are gathering, there are two elements to know about: mobilization and concentration. Here's an easy explanation for the two. Mobilization is where your soldiers are supposed to report to once war is declared. Once they are gathered at the mobilization point, they are given their equipment, weapons, ammo, etc. Then they are shipped out to the concentration point. The concentration point is just where the war is going to be fought, or at least where you need your primary units at the beginning of the conflict. In this case, the concentration point would be near the Rhine, on the border between France and the southern German states. How the Prussians and French approached mobilization and concentration was different. In the Prussian army, they had permanent territorial units, who would then assemble at their local depots, which is where they would receive their equipment, then add local reservists to bring their units, companies, and battalions up to full strength. Then, once they were at full strength, the Corps would ship out from their territorial division to the combat zone, or concentration point. The French, on the other hand, would immediately send whatever soldiers they had, even if they were only in small groups, from the mobilization point to the concentration point. Those men would receive their equipment closer to the actual concentration point. The French did mobilization in this way because they were primarily a professional army, and so French leadership believed that their veterans could gather quickly, then make their way to the border, and then from there, whatever reserves they needed to bring their units up to full strength could be brought in. And the men who didn't have their full equipment could be fully supplied. It was all about getting to the combat zone quicker than the enemy could, and then figuring out the rest of the logistics. The French system could, in theory, be quicker. Rather than having units wait for reserves to come in to bring them up to full strength, then go to the combat zone, their units could immediately head towards the combat zone into a position to do battle. The problem the French ran into at the start of the Franco-Prussian War was that their railroad system was not equipped for this. France did not have enough strategic railways, and a strategic railway is a double-tracked line coming from either an industrial or a high population center. Prussia had a solid advantage in the strategic railway element, with 6 double-tracked lines compared to France's 4. Having a double-tracked line is important because it can handle movement in both directions, while single-track lines can only handle movement in one direction. Most of France's rail network at this point were single-tracked, while Prussia had prioritized double-tracked lines. That's why the German states could move 50 trains a day compared to France's only 12. To showcase how much better the German railways were, in the war, it took France 3 weeks to assemble an army corps, while for Prussia, it only took them 3 to 7 days to do that same task. The German rail lines weren't just designed better. Their war planners had more efficiently integrated their use into the military structure. Moltke and his generals worked with the German rail lines before the war to create a plan, so that once war was declared, the lines that would have been used for civilian use would be suspended, and then a meticulous plan would be triggered with exact timetables on when men or material would be shipped out from any given station. That plan wasn't just theorized, it was practiced by army units and railroads. Men knew exactly what to do and where to go once war broke out with France, while the railroad knew how to efficiently ship them to the combat zone. French leadership did not take this kind of care in the details. That's why, when all their men went rushing to the war zone, the rail system became overwhelmed and logjams occurred, especially with regards to material. Unloading supply trains and getting said supplies to the men miles away from the railhead took time and created confusion as workers tried to unload supplies quickly to keep the rail lines open. All that congestion and confusion led French forces to be drastically short of men fully equipped and ready for battle. By the 7th day of mobilization, French divisions were supposed to have 9,100 men, but they were at just 6,500. And while all of them had their chassepot rifles, many were without cartridges, since those were shipped separately. Overall, 1 week after the war had been declared, Napoleon's forces were severely short of the manpower they had expected. At Strasbourg, they had 40,000 men, but they were supposed to have 100,000. As for Metz, where the main army of the Rhine was, he had 100,000 ill-equipped men, and not the bare minimum 150,000 soldiers that Napoleon planned for before the war. After 3 weeks of mobilization, France had gathered just over 300,000 soldiers in the border region, while the German armies, led by Prussia, had 426,000. The French war plan had originally been to gather their large professional army quickly and invade the southern German states. While Austria struck from the east into Prussia, the French also planned to land a marine force in the Baltic region. These plans are in shambles now. Prussia had mobilized faster than any of the French commanders could have imagined. They had firmly believed the Prussians would have to leave large forces in the Baltic region and in their eastern Silesia region to protect against a French seaborne invasion and a possible attack by an Austrian force. That dispersal of Prussian troops would lead the Rhineland and the southern German states even lower on troop totals, which would make them vulnerable to the French advance. However, Moltke's planning and efficiency gathered a large Prussian army in the Rhineland that could counter any French attack, or if that attack didn't come, could advance into French territory. That is exactly what happened. France, after having been beaten in the mobilization game, would have to fight this war on the defensive, instead of the offensive like many had assumed in the lead up to the war. Now that you have enough background info to make your head explode, let's go into the actual action and the battles that decided this war. France's war plan relied on the flawed notion that simply because they had the larger standing army, they would mobilize faster than the Prussians, and then they would take the offensive into the German lands. Like I said in the mobilization chapter, that didn't happen, which left Napoleon's army in a conundrum. France needed to attack into German territory in order to convince Austria, Denmark, and Italy to join the fight on their side. As well, it was politically important for Napoleon's regime to be seen by the French people as taking the offensive to the Prussians, and not sitting back on the defensive fighting the war on French land. However, French logistics are such a mess that they are in no position to pull off an extended offensive into the German lands. So Napoleon decides on a symbolic first move to start the war. On July 29th, Frossard led the French army of the Rhine on a move to take the Prussian town of Saarbrücken. The French forces entered and took the town on August 2nd. However, this move by the French had no real strategic value. Napoleon and his commanders did try to sell it as a great victory to their people though. On the Prussian side, Moltke's army would be fully mobilized on August 5th, and by pushing east, the French army was now strung out in the tight space between Metz and Saarbrücken. With 400,000 Prussian troops above and below that French force, they were looking at a vast encirclement, while also dangerously extending the gap between Napoleon's main force and MacMahon's First Corps in Alsace. Taking Saarbrücken was simply about taking some piece of German territory. The French forces didn't have the logistics or the manpower to actually hold it. That's why once Moltke got his forces moving on August 5th, the French abandoned Saarbrücken to form a new defensive line along the Moselle River near Metz. It would have been considerably wiser for Napoleon if he had never advanced east, and instead stayed put at Metz, while pulling MacMahon's forces closer back to his own to form a defensive line to await the Prussian invasion, which was perfect for Moltke's plan of approach. Moltke's plan involved what is called pocket battles, which meant leaving wide gaps between his three armies in order to make their movement and supply easier. Those forces would then maneuver the enemy into a pocket to surround and destroy them. That is how Moltke had defeated Austria at Königgrätz. This strategy did not come without risk though. Prince Wilhelm's Third Army in the south would be isolated due to the Vosges Mountains. That Third Army was the key first strike for Moltke. He planned for his Third Army of 125,000 to attack and hammer MacMahon's 45,000 troops out of their defensive positions at Weisenberg and Froschweiler, then pass through the Vosges Mountains and wheel north to face Napoleon's army of the Rhine. That would force Napoleon's army to either confront the Prussian Third Army coming from the south, or the Prussian First and Second Armies coming from the east. If the French divided their forces, they would be defeated in detail. And if they massed together, the Prussians would hit them in their front and flanks, completely encircling Napoleon's army. All of these movements could be made possible because of the terrible state of French cavalry. During the first week of August in 1870, they were nowhere to be found. French cavalry units had very little interest in scouting duties, which left Napoleon and Lesboeuf, Napoleon's war minister, who became his chief of staff when war broke out, blind to the Prussian movements. On the Prussian side, they knew exactly where the French were at all times, abiding by the saying, better to be everywhere with one's cavalry than stuck in big masses. At this point in the first week of August, here's how the French forces were positioned. The force that took Saarbrücken was pulling back to the west to connect with the main army of the Rhine, which was in a blocking position near the Moselle. As well, the French had a reserve force situated at Nancy. This all meant that MacMahon's force in the south was all alone, with only a loose link to the force at Belfort. Prince Wilhelm's Third Army would make contact with MacMahon's First Corps on August 4th, 1870 in the Battle of Weissenberg. MacMahon's army of 45,000 had very important responsibilities in this southern sector. They were expected to hold the line of the Vosges and threaten the flank of any Prussian attack towards Strasbourg. They were also needed to stay in contact with both forces at Belfort and the Army of the Rhine at the same time. To accomplish all of these goals, MacMahon divided his 4 divisions in a wide square. One division and his headquarters were at Hagenau, a second division was at Froschweiler, a third was at Lembeck, and a fourth was at Weissenberg. This placement would simultaneously defend the border with Germany, keep contact with Feli's Corps, and still have 2 divisions far south enough to threaten the flank of any Prussian push towards Strasbourg or Belfort. The severe drawback was that each division was separated by 10 to 20 miles of rough country, which meant that if MacMahon was attacked on any of the corners of the square, none of the French divisions would have enough time to march to the battle. What made this worse was, like I said, the French had very little intelligence on where the Prussian armies were, since their cavalry was all but useless at scouting. MacMahon had no idea 80,000 Prussians were barreling down on his divisions. When the Battle of Weissenberg began, the French were so caught off guard that MacMahon was actually planning on moving his headquarters to that town on the day of the battle. On the morning of the battle, 8 French battalions were facing 29 Prussian ones. The French soldiers did make an admirable defense, utilizing natural fortifications like stone walls, and with the long range of the Chassepot rifle, they were able to stifle the early Prussian assaults. The mitrailleuse machine guns were particularly frightening to the Prussian troops, since they tended to lock onto a single person and fire at them until the person was essentially vaporized. Even though these initial frontal assaults took heavy casualties, that was not the primary aim of Prussian attacks. Like I mentioned in the warfare chapter, the Prussians looked to find the enemy's flanks and lines of retreat, and then press them there. In this battle, the French flanks were what is called up in the air in military terms, meaning they were not protected by any natural feature or by supporting troops or reserves. The Prussians pushed the French flanks hard until completely encircling the force, and because MacMahon's divisions were so spread out, no other division could come to their aid. Another key element that helped push this battle in Prussia's favor was their artillery being willing to move in close with the infantry, in direct fire against the French positions. Meanwhile, the French artillery continually sat far back while using their ineffective time-fuse shells. By afternoon on August 4th, the battle was over. MacMahon responded to this battle by attempting to pull together the remnants of the Weissenberg division with other forces and make a fighting retreat to link up with the Army of the Rhine. They were first to collect at a village named Froschweiler, before heading northwest towards Metz. The Prussians, on the other hand, had learned some valuable lessons from this battle. For one, the Chassepot's range stunned Prussian commanders. As well, their lack of faith in the Bavarian troops seemed justified, as they had performed particularly poorly in this battle. Another interesting note is that in this battle, the Prussians encountered African soldiers for the first time. The Algerian units had laid havoc on Prussian assaults, which led many Prussian soldiers to grow fearful of facing Algerian units in the future. The most important lesson was that Prussian and Bavarian commanders felt that the French had underutilized the chassepot rifle. Instead of exploiting its range, accuracy, and rate of fire by lengthening their front, the French chose to mass their troops in narrow positions that were easily crushed by artillery and outflanked. Prussian maneuverability would be key moving forward against the static French forces. On August 6th, Moltke's main thrust with 1st and 2nd Army made their first major contact with the Army of the Rhine. That was at Spicheren. With the 3rd Army winning the victory at Weisenberg, Moltke felt comfortable to push his 1st and 2nd Armies west, in the hopes of fully encircling the French army at Metz, and winning a decisive victory there. The French move to take the town of Saarbrücken actually played into Moltke's plan. He wanted the French forces to move as far east as possible, so that his 3 armies could maneuver around them. The French commanders did realize how exposed they were at Saarbrücken, and retreated back to the defensive positions at Spicheren and Forbach. Moltke planned to push his main 2nd Army against the defenses at Spicheren and Forbach, while his 1st Army stayed on the French left flank. The plan didn't exactly go the way he wanted to, though. The leader of 1st Army, Steinmetz, who was a hero in the Austro-Prussian War, was not a man who liked to be in a support flanking role, and so he pushed the 1st Army south towards Saarbrücken, which put his forces directly in the path of 2nd Army. Steinmetz was hungry for a battle, and it was rumored he was senile, which was why Moltke didn't even want to give him a command before the war. But Steinmetz was close to King Wilhelm, so Moltke didn't have much of a choice. Steinmetz's 1st Army made contact with the French forces defending from Forbach to Spicheren on the morning of August 6th. On the French side, they had moved to these positions because of how indefensible Saarbrücken was. The ridge from Forbach to Spicheren was an ideal defensive spot in comparison. The heights of Spicheren give the defending forces clear fields of fire across the entire valley. The only issue is that the position can be easily flanked. To counter this threat, Frossard placed only one of his 3 divisions on the central height, anchoring the right flank. The other 2 French divisions would be spaced out towards Forbach to protect against any Prussian attempt to turn the French left flank. The right flank would be protected by the nearest unit of Bazaine's forces just 7 miles away. The battle itself started because of Prussian military ideology. The Prussian approach to battle was different than most 19th century militaries. Most preferred set-piece contests, never starting a battle until their full force was ready and available. The Prussians had a rougher approach. They let small advance guards probe heavily defended positions. Then they would slowly reinforce those small attacks throughout the course of the day. This caused great confusion for defenders, since they never knew if they were engaged in a small skirmish or a full-scale assault. At Spicheren, Prussian forces thought they were facing a French rearguard and rushed to attack it, only to be brutally repelled. The only thing that saved the Prussian forces from being completely swept from the field by French artillery and counterattacks was their Krupp artillery, which kept the French at bay. Prussian reinforcements then arrived and renewed the attack, which got crushed again. At this point, the Prussians are reeling and vulnerable. A strong counterattack could push them all the way out of Saarbrücken in an embarrassing defeat. However, Frossard chooses to hold tight, sticking with the French military tendency to fight on the defensive in tightly anchored positions. This is the key moment in the battle. After reaching the outskirts of Saarbrücken, the 2nd Army units that hear the sound of the battle rush to join in. That leads to an increasing number of Prussian soldiers joining the point of attack. On the French side, at this point in the day, Bazaine finally agrees to send his closest reinforcement group that was 7 miles away to join the fight. But they were sent too late in the day to make an impact on the battle. The 3rd Prussian attack of the day succeeded in turning the French right flank at the central height. By taking that high point and forcing the French forces to yield the high ground, they were in a strong position to win the battle. Frossard briefly entertains the idea of reforming his position in the Spicheren area, but decided against it after Prussian forces maneuvered toward his unguarded left flank and rear. He would retreat his forces back to the Moselle. Ironically, during this retreat, their forces collided with the late arriving reinforcements from Bazaine. There is plenty of controversy around Bazaine and Frossard for the slowness at which they approached this battle. Frossard took a long time to grasp he was facing a major Prussian attack. At 5:15, while the Prussians were beginning their final push, he actually wired Bazaine that the fighting was calming down. Bazaine also reacted slowly. A major reason was that his divisions were spread out over 40 miles, and so that if he sent a large force to Spicheren, he would have severely narrowed his position. Even though it was a Prussian victory, and their commanders showed good initiative moving towards the sounds of guns, it was still a costly victory. Nearly 5,000 were cut down in the battle, and at this point in the war, the Prussians were losing 2 men for every 1 French casualty. The losses at Weissenberg and Spicheren had deeply alarmed Napoleon. The Prussians seemed to be picking off isolated French forces one at a time, so he looked to concentrate his different spread out forces. He would now call up MacMahon's army from the south to form a more compact defense. That contracted defense plan would be frustrated by the Battle of Froschweiler. That also took place on August 6th. This battle would play out eerily similarly as the Battle of Spicheren. After their victory at Weissenberg, Prince Frederick and Third Army looked to find MacMahon's forces, before wheeling north to link up with First and Second Armies. At first, he believed MacMahon had retreated to Strasbourg. However, he quickly found out that MacMahon had barely moved since Weissenberg, preferring to hold up in the strong positions at the town of Froschweiler. Before the war, MacMahon had even dreamed of fighting a battle against the Prussians at this village. Froschweiler was an important strategic point for the French, since it was key to the control of the Bleis-Strasbourg Railroad. As well, if the French lost this town, the garrison at Strasbourg would be isolated. And finally, by taking control of that railroad, it would have been much easier for the Prussians to supply their armies as they advanced into France. Froschweiler was a defensive strongpoint, much like Spicheren. It was located on a hill overlooking the Sauer River, with a parallel road that connected Froschweiler with the towns of Iberach on the right and Legensalzbach on the left. This created a bowl-like semicircle in which the French could devastate any enemy attacking force, perfect for the chassepot rifle. The problem with Froschweiler was the same one with Spicheren. It could be flanked, especially by a large army that could fan out, which is exactly what the Prussians had at their disposal. They would have 100,000 troops against MacMahon's 50,000 for this battle. This battle also started by accident, as Prussian forces stumbled into the French positions, starting from the left flank to the right. In typical Prussian fashion, their follow-up units moved towards the sounds of battle, anchoring their center in the town of Worth. The initial Prussian attacks were devastated by the chassepot and their machine guns, cutting down wave after wave of Prussian assaults. As well, the Sauer River slowed their advance when the Prussian soldiers tried to cross it under heavy fire. By early afternoon, MacMahon had an opportunity to counterattack in force to win the battle, but decided on the same approach Frossard did, preferring to stay on the defensive, hold up in strong positions. Then, on the French right, more Prussian reinforcements joined the fight, and once again, they were blasted back. However, this is the key moment in the battle, as Prussian artillery is on the field in force, and absolutely hammers the French right, not just destroying their counterattack, but also pounding their static positions on the right flank. Any French artillery that tries to counterfire is immediately silenced. The Krupp guns are so effective that the right is now wide open to attack. More Prussian reinforcements arrive to come in to advance on the French right. MacMahon doesn't have any significant reserves left at this point. He used them all up trying to stop the different Prussian attacks throughout the day. So he sends in his heavy cavalry, and they get utterly massacred. The cavalry assault sees 800 of the 1,200 total cut down without a single rider getting to within 50 yards of the enemy. This is an interesting moment in military history, because the Prussians didn't use the traditional Napoleonic era tactic, which was forming a square to defend against a cavalry attack, like the British used at Waterloo. Instead, they simply stood in lines and just fired rapidly, cutting down the advancing horsemen. With the French right now turned, the battle is effectively over, as the French middle and the left are hit from the flank and rear. And then it gets worse. The Prussians then turn the French left as well. The Prussian pincer will now trap the French forces left behind at Froschweiler, leading to a panic-ridden retreat by what was left of MacMahon's forces. The battle is effectively over at 5 p.m. on August 6th. This battle is another example of French strategic weaknesses. MacMahon chose to huddle his forces in static defenses, which made them vulnerable to a numerically superior foe. At the height of the battle, the Prussians had 88,000 troops to France's 50,000. The Prussians used loose and opportunistic probes all along the French lines, until they outmaneuvered them at the flanks. Once the right flank fell, MacMahon had nothing left to stop the Prussian pincer move that was coming. Now MacMahon's army in the south was in complete disarray, retreating and ineffective. Prussia's Third Army has options. They can go south or west. In the west, they can continue to pursue MacMahon's army. As well, they can connect with First and Second Armies near Metz to destroy Napoleon's army of the Rhine. Or they can go south to put Strasbourg under siege. They choose to split, sending part of their forces south to put Strasbourg under siege. That siege would last from August 14th until September 28th. The main force will start heading west to threaten the army of the Rhine. The bigger picture problem presented by Froschweiler is that Napoleon has lost his ability to create a concentrated defense, and the door to France is wide open. Now is a good time to switch gears real quick and talk about the war at sea during the Franco-Prussian War. Let's answer the question, did the navies of these two sides contribute in any meaningful way? Well, the French Navy was expected to be a huge advantage in this clash. The French Navy was Europe's second largest with 470 ships, and was 10 times the size of Prussia's. France also had 45 ironclad battleships, frigates, and floating batteries, while Prussia had just a total of 5 ironclads, and they were tasked with protecting a coast of 600 miles. That is why originally Napoleon planned for this naval advantage to aid in an amphibious assault by 9,000 Marines and 20,000 reserves. This assault force could strike at Prussia's strategic railways and cause serious damage to Moltke's precise mobilization plan. The plan had a major problem though. Prussian coastal battery Krupp guns had a range of 4,000 yards, which was nearly twice the range of French warships, putting the French fleet in extreme risk. The guns were not the only problem. The French fleet was not designed for this kind of war. They had limited floating batteries. The reason for that is that the French had designed their navy to challenge the British on the seas, and so it was a blue water navy, and not built for heavy gun duels with shore batteries to prepare a coast for an amphibious assault. To top it off, due to British and Russian pressure on Denmark to stay neutral, they only offered lukewarm support in the event of a French amphibious assault. The 50,000 troops of Denmark were key to the success of any French attack on the Prussian coast, and so the amphibious assault plan was scrapped. The French Navy also attempted a blockade of the Prussian coast, which should have caused real issues, since Prussia was heavily reliant on the imports of raw materials, and so a strong French blockade could have really hurt their war effort. The French blockade was never able to be strong enough though. For one, they didn't want to provoke the British, and so any ship flying their flag was allowed to pass through. And for another, French warships had a coal problem. French warships at this time had a storage capacity of 250 tons for coal in their bunkers. But while on blockade duty, they burned 200 tons per day. That forced French ships to either stay in place to preserve coal, or have to make constant trips back to France to reload on coal. Ultimately, in September of 1870, the leaky blockade was abandoned, and the war at sea for the Franco-Prussian War was, rather pathetically, over. Back to the land campaigns. After the losses at Spicheren and Froschweiler, panic started to hit Napoleon's regime. Their hoped-for allies, like Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Denmark, all now refused to enter the war, because they were sure Prussia was going to win. The panic then forced several notable changes. Due to heavy Republican criticism led by Favre and Gambetta, the chief minister of France, Oliver, resigned. He is followed in resignations by both Leboeuf, the war minister, and the foreign minister Gramont, who is one of the chief architects of this war. On the military side, on August 9th, Napoleon relinquished direct command of the Army of the Rhine to Bazaine. However, he kept the title of commander-in-chief, which confused things. At this point, Prussian cavalry has crossed the Moselle and have cut off Metz from communication with Paris. The French Army of the Rhine has only one realistic option for success: to retreat from Metz to Chalon until a further retreat to Paris. This would give MacMahon the ability to reconstruct his shattered forces from the interior of France, and it would force the Prussians to have to chase after this French army. The Prussian forces' logistic lines would then become overextended and exposed because of how deep into France they would have to go. However, Napoleon and Bazaine delayed, unable to make a decisive decision. They even entertained the idea of trying to counterattack the Prussian forces converging on them. This delay would be one of the biggest factors as to why France lost the war. Finally, after a full week of indecision, Bazaine gets his army at Metz to start to move west towards Verdun, with the goal of then reaching Chalon. Bazaine had actually not liked the retreat idea. He preferred to stand and fight a defensive battle around Metz, but Napoleon ordered him to move. Moltke, on the other hand, was busy surrounding Metz with his 200,000-man force. At Borny, a small battle occurs which slows Bazaine's retreat. The retreat is frustrated even more by Prussian cavalry, though. They continue to raid any undefended supply trains. The French supply train is 40 miles long, and so it takes significant resources to protect it. This is when Moltke starts pushing a bold move. He will take 5 corps and wheel them around Metz. The goal is to hit the rear and flank of the French army retreating from Metz. This can be made possible because the bridges across the Moselle have been abandoned by Bazaine without a fight. On August 16th at Mars-la-Tour, Prussian forces will collide with the retreating French. This battle is another one caused by Prussian subordinates taking the initiative. 2 Prussian divisions would run headfirst into 4 French corps around Rezonville. Bazaine draws the wrong conclusion from this contact. He believes Moltke is trying to push his forces away from Metz, to be destroyed in the open fields. Moltke is actually trying to do the opposite. He wants to push the French back into the Metz fortifications, to encircle them into a siege. That is why Bazaine responds to the battle by bringing his forces in a semicircle from just north of Bienville to Gravelotte. At this point, the French have a massive numerical superiority, and could have pushed at the Prussian left at Mars-la-Tour, and at their right at Bienville. However, stop me if you heard this one before, Bazaine prefers to sit on the defensive. Even after the initial Prussian assaults get hammered, he refuses to let his forces go on the offensive, terrified that this is all a plan by Moltke to suck his forces away from Metz. Then, the perfect opportunity to win this battle arrives. On the French right, another corps arrives as reinforcements, and plants itself at Mars-la-Tour. With their right flank anchored, the French army could now have pushed forward in their center, towards Tronville, and overwhelm the Prussian forces there. They have an advantage of 20,000 troops in this critical sector, and the Prussian forces have been exhausted by their failed assaults. However, still, Bazaine refuses to take the offensive. He actually never leaves Gravelotte during the battle, even though the major fighting is on his right flank. By 3:30, the opportunity for victory has passed away, as more Prussian reinforcements pushed by Moltke have arrived at the field. Those units try to force the French right, but are brutally cut down at Mars-la-Tour. Because of the reinforcements, the Prussians have a decisive advantage in artillery. Their gun line is roughly 2 miles long, from Flaigny to Tronville. Prussian guns have once again throughout this day prevented defeat. Anytime even a small French counterattack gets going, or French artillery tries to destroy the Prussian infantry, the Krupp guns respond with devastating effects. Ultimately, by nightfall, the battle peters out. The Prussians hold a line from Mars-la-Tour to Vionville. The battle is seen as a stalemate, with both sides losing roughly 16,000 each. It is a massive strategic victory for the Prussians though. They are now blocking the main French army's retreat west, and those casualties taken by the French cannot be easily replaced. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, the French army relied upon experienced veterans and did not have a strong pool of military men to draw from. So taking casualties on a 1-to-1 ratio with Prussia, who does have a deep pool of military men, is just not sustainable. Even worse, this could easily have been a French victory. They had 20 divisions facing 7 Prussian divisions, and they had a garrison of 30,000 in the east at Metz that would have pinned down the majority of Moltke's forces in the east. Bazaine could have struck hard at the isolated Prussian forces west of the Moselle, destroying them, then continuing on west with an open path to Chalon. Instead, he let 30,000 troops do the job of what should have taken 600,000, completely blocking his retreat west to Verdun. Moltke immediately grasps the significance of Mars-la-Tour and pulls in as many reinforcements as he can. Moltke's plan is for a decisive encirclement on the outskirts of Metz. From there, he can push the Army of the Rhine north or east. The north would take the French forces to Luxembourg, where the rules of war dictated that since Luxembourg was a neutral, the French would have to put down their weapons and essentially give up on the fight, not leaving Luxembourg for the rest of the war. If the Prussians pushed them east instead, the French would be forced into the fortress at Metz, to be starved into submission. Bazaine, in reaction to his predicament, pulls his force closer to Metz into a defensive position. Many of his commanders did not agree with this move. They felt the army could still make an attempt to fight towards Verdun, or at the very least retreat north to Sedan. Bazaine didn't like either of those two options, because it would mean abandoning most of his supplies, and leave his flanks open to Prussian attacks. Bazaine would align his forces on the Plappeville Ridge, which is right above Gravelotte, and block the western approach towards Metz. His left flank is near Gravelotte, and his right is near St. Privat. The left flank is a strong position, anchored by hills and ravines. The right, not so much. There are no natural obstacles on the right near St. Privat, making it up in the air in military terms. To make matters worse, Bazaine didn't even reinforce this vulnerable right flank with extra artillery to protect it. And to top off the strategic disaster that was Bazaine, for this battle his reserves were 4 miles away from St. Privat. That meant it would take hours to reinforce the vulnerable north if it came under threat. At this point, on the eve of the battle, Bazaine was completely overwhelmed with defeatism. During the actual battle, he would stay mostly at his headquarters, only briefly venturing out. On August 18th, the battle begins in the early morning hours. This is the first full set-piece battle of the war, instead of an accidental clash like the earlier battles. Moltke and the Germans would have 200,000 men and 730 guns, spread out between their 1st and 2nd armies for the battle. They were first positioned from Vionville to Mars-la-Tour, before swinging north to form a new line from Gravelotte in the south to Runcourt in the north. Opposing the Prussians, the French have 160,000 troops and 520 guns. The battle begins in the center, at first with an attack in the northern center, and then another one in the southern center. Both of these attacks are decimated by French rifle fire. The Prussian forces in the center have moved into battle too quickly. It actually even leads to their artillery in that sector rushing too close to the French lines and being raked by crossfire. Moltke is furious by this premature action by overzealous subordinates. In order for an encirclement to work properly, you must pin down the enemy's heavily defended front only after the flanking force is ready to strike. At this early moment in the day, the Prussian forces in the north looking to turn the French right are not ready, and so the attack in the center is useless bloodshed. When the center forces are pushed back, and before the Prussian left is ready, is when the French have a golden opportunity to counterattack and win the battle. But Bazaine does nothing. By 3:30, the Prussian left is ready and fully positioned with artillery. They then proceed to blast the ever-living daylights out of the French force near St. Privat. The Prussians used 270 guns to fire 20,000 shells. That's roughly 3 times as many shells as the French used in the entire battle. Prussian artillery is so effective across the front that anytime a French cannon or one of their machine guns open up, they are quickly silenced. An interesting fact about this battle: 70% of French casualties were due to artillery fire, while 70% of Prussian casualties, on the other hand, were caused by the chassepot rifle. Anyway, after the heavy bombardment on the French right in several bloody assaults, the French flank is in shambles. The Prussians can slowly start to push south to roll up the entire position of the French from north to south. Bazaine actually did respond to the threat on his right, but it wasn't the response he needed. He actually pulled back his reserves who had started to head north in relief of the threatened sector. He was mentally ready for a retreat before the battle had even started. And so now, that's what the French must do. Their army does escape total destruction, due primarily to Prussian exhaustion. But now they are stuck in Metz, with no way to break out or to sustain themselves from within. The only far-off hope they have is a relief force coming to their aid. The Battle of Gravelotte gets primarily put on Bazaine as the chief architect of failure. The French government would actually try and convict him for treason after the war. During the fight, he only issued a couple of minor orders. Instead, he chose to hide in his headquarters. He never once went close to the fighting to take charge of the situation. In fact, when officers came to him appealing for instructions, he simply said, "Your general has placed you in very strong positions. He must defend them." To cap off the incompetence, Bazaine had 120 guns and 30,000 elite troops in reserve, and he did nothing with them. The one time their commander, Bourbaki, tried to move them north to aid the right flank, Bazaine called them back to prepare for a retreat. Bazaine went even as far as to forbid his generals from dipping into the army's ammunition reserve, which effectively disarmed many frontline units. It's no wonder history has not been kind to his performance. After the fighting died down and the French forces reconfigured themselves, there was an initial feeling on the Prussian side of defeat. They had lost 20,000 men compared to France's 12,000, just to take a ridgeline, and they didn't even completely destroy the French army. However, this was a grand strategic victory. The possible escape route north to Sedan was now gone, and the Prussian encirclement of Metz was complete. The siege of Metz would last until October, when French forces finally surrendered. Before that surrender of Metz, the Prussians still had to deal with the French army gathering at Chalon. Napoleon III is getting more and more depressed by the war, and indecision continues to overwhelm him. It doesn't help that his health is continuing to decline. At first, he agrees with his generals MacMahon and Trouche that the army gathered at Chalon should be used in defense of Paris. However, after talking with his wife, the Empress of France Eugenie, he decided to use that army of Chalon in an attempt to relieve the encircled force at Metz. This decision would lead to the end of the Second Empire of France. After encircling Bazaine into Metz for a siege, Moltke started to reconfigure his forces. He created a new Fourth Army. He created it by taking extra troops that were not needed for the siege from Second and First Armies. This new army would have 120,000 troops and was called the Army of the Meuse. Its goals were to pursue MacMahon and threaten Paris. An additional 120,000 troops were left behind to continue the siege at Metz, while the Crown Prince's Third Army still had 180,000 strong further south. The Army of the Meuse and Third Army were to work together to start heading west. But as they move west, they still have to solve the mystery of where MacMahon's Army of Chalon, with 130,000 troops and 420 guns, is going to go next. MacMahon preferred to retire to Paris, to combine with its 150,000 strong garrison. But French leaders like Napoleon and his Empress Eugenie felt the sight of a defeated French army marching into Paris would cause revolts. And so they pushed MacMahon to drive north towards Sedan to link up with Bazaine. MacMahon was actually encouraged to make this move by a dispatch he received from Bazaine, which talked about an attempted breakout move by the Army of the Rhine towards Sedan. However, this never actually happens, and Bazaine never seriously tries to push his army out of the Prussian siege. At this point, it wasn't just Bazaine who was pessimistic about a breakout attempt. His other commanding generals advised him against a breakout attempt, because the Army of the Rhine was just too demoralized and its supply lines were too bulky to realistically make an offensive move. As the Army of the Meuse and Third Army continue to move west, Moltke makes a bold gamble. He guesses that MacMahon's army, which he knows has left Chalon, is heading north in relief of Metz, and so he orders his two armies to start wheeling north to find it. This is a bold decision, because if MacMahon had caught the Prussian armies in the middle of a maneuver, he could have defeated them in detail. As well, if Moltke was wrong, the Prussian armies would waste valuable time chasing north after a phantom French army. On August 28th, Moltke's intuition was vindicated after Prussian cavalry captured MacMahon's marching orders. The two Prussian armies will continue north, looking to pin the French army between the Meuse and the Argonne forest. On August 30th, the Prussians make contact with MacMahon's army. MacMahon is being pressed by two Prussian armies, one from the east and one from the south, forcing him north towards Sedan. And just like that, MacMahon has been cut off from Bazaine. And if he tries to outrun these two Prussian armies, he will lose all of his baggage and ammunition. That leaves Belgium as the only option for retreat, but Belgium is neutral, and so that would mean the loss of an entire French army for the duration of the war. So really, he has little choice but to stand and fight at Sedan. He is cornered. It is not just MacMahon who is cornered though. Napoleon is with this army, and so he is in direct danger of being taken captive by the Prussians. Moltke's Third Army is coming in from the west, and the Army of the Meuse is coming from the east. He then divides them further by detaching a smaller force north to complete the encirclement, by positioning it between Sedan and Belgium. So there goes MacMahon's last escape route. Once again, French cavalry is useless, as the Prussian cavalry move with impunity, tracking every move MacMahon makes. The climactic end of the Second Empire is at hand. MacMahon positions his forces in a triangle on the eastern side of the fortress of Sedan. While Moltke's Meuse army moves up the right bank of the Meuse, the Third Army surges ahead on the left. On September 1st, the Battle of Sedan begins. The two Prussian armies slowly encircled the city over the course of the day in tough urban fighting. The real damage, though, is done by the Prussian artillery. Moltke's artillery masses create a circle that engulfs the French army of Chalon in fire. Anytime French artillery tries to fire off shells, or a machine gun opens up, or a counterattack is launched, they are quickly targeted by accurate and deadly Krupp guns. Once again. By the end of the day, the German forces will have 700 guns firing a total of 20,000 shells. This is the first battle of the war with a significant casualty difference. The French lost 17,000 to Prussia's 9,000. Every other battle, the numbers were much closer to 1-1. Finally, with the encirclement complete and the Prussian artillery leveling everything that moves, Napoleon surrenders. At first, the French were hoping for generous terms, asking for their men to be allowed to march away with their arms and baggage paroled. Being paroled in the military back then basically meant that you promised not to join back into the French army and fight against the Prussians for the duration of the war. Moltke and Bismarck quickly crushed that idea. They were rightfully worried that these troops would be used by whatever new government replaced Napoleon's, and so they demanded complete unconditional surrender, with these troops to be sent to prison camps for the duration of the war. To really put the fear into the French, they stated that if their terms were not accepted by 9 a.m. on September 2nd, they would resume bombarding their forces until there was nothing left. The French army of Chalon then surrendered, and 80,000 troops were marched to Prussian prison camps. The most stunning fact about this war, and this Battle of Sedan, is the fact that the Prussian army managed to capture the leader of the opposing country they were fighting. Napoleon's capture at Sedan would mark the end of the Second Empire, and lead to a revolution in Paris proclaiming a new republic, France's Third Republic. For the Prussians, this victory was glorious. King Wilhelm actually called it Prussia's Tilsit, a reference to the French-imposed treaty in 1807 by Napoleon Bonaparte that annexed half of Prussia's territory and population. Sedan also capped off the primary stage of the Franco-Prussian War, with the French professional military that had fought and won so many battles across the globe being soundly defeated. The war itself wasn't fully over yet. Even though the French Emperor Napoleon and their primary professional armies had been defeated at Metz and Sedan, the French people would continue to fight on until January of 1871. Gambetta took charge and formed the Government of National Defense after Sedan, and utilizing the excitement for the new republic, he determined to fight on for a peace that didn't include ceding territory to Prussia. Bismarck and Prussia weren't going to accept any peace without territorial compensation. They cited that because France had declared war on Prussia 30 times over the past 200 years, the German people needed a buffer zone to protect them from future French aggression. The buffer zone Bismarck was eyeing was Alsace and Lorraine. French leaders like Gambetta and Favre, along with the people of France, didn't feel that was just. They believed this war was waged against Napoleon and his regime. So because France was now a republic, they shouldn't have to pay for the sins of their previous emperor. This would lead to the siege of Paris starting on September 19th, when Montcalm's Third Army and the Army of the Meuse encircled the historic city. The Republican government was able to raise an army of 400,000 in defense of the city, but they were mostly poorly trained citizen soldiers with outdated weapons who could only be suitable for stationary defense duty. The several times the French tried to use that Paris force on a breakout attempt, they were crushed easily by the professional army of the Prussians. That wasn't the only army the Government of National Defense raised. They raised another one south of Paris at Orleans. But their attempts to drive north to relieve Paris were defeated by Montcalm's newly raised army in a blocking position near Orleans and Paris. Several more forces are worth mentioning as well. They had an army of the north near Ames, but it never really made any significant moves. As well, Prussia had an army of the south that held in check the French force at Dijon. Overall, the major victories were over after Sedan. The only path to success for France's Republican military was if they focused on guerrilla warfare techniques. But Gambetta never prioritized that style of fighting. He chose to believe that a civilian army flush with Republican pride could defeat the highly professional Prussian military. An interesting note, while the siege of Paris was going on, the official creation of the German state occurred on January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Another fascinating tidbit is that at one point in the siege of Paris, we actually see the first attempt at strategic bombing, when the Prussian army, pushed by Bismarck, started bombarding the city, hoping to force the French people to sue for peace. Finally though, on January 28, 1871, the siege of Paris ended, when the initial details to a peace treaty to end the war were agreed to. That peace treaty is what I'm going to cover next. The peace to end the Franco-Prussian War does not get talked about enough, in my opinion, as it helps to set the stage for the more infamous Treaty of Versailles to end World War I. Let's go into the actual terms imposed on France by Bismarck and Germany to see how familiar they are with the later and more analyzed Treaty of Versailles. For this treaty, Bismarck would negotiate against Thiers, who replaced Gambetta after winning the election to become president of the Third Republic in February. He won by promising to end the war. Gambetta, though, had doggedly vowed to fight the war to the last man. Thiers was just looking to end the French suffering. Bismarck looked to capitalize on this instability and negotiate a treaty that would make France weak, unable to be a threat to Germany, which would give this newly created German state time to solidify itself. That started with a buffer zone to protect Germany from any kind of revenge war waged by France. That zone was Alsace and Lorraine, which were two traditionally French regions that were handed over to Germany in this treaty. Along with those territories, the key strategic fortresses of Metz and Strasbourg were now German. Bismarck initially wanted Belfort too, but settled for a German victory parade with 30,000 troops marching through Paris. Finally, the most important and controversial provision of this treaty was an indemnity payment of 5 billion francs, which is roughly $25 billion by today's standards. Thiers, on the other side, pleaded for a lower payment of 1.5 billion, since the war had cost France 12 billion. Bismarck was unmoved though, replying that if France didn't raise the 5 billion, Germany would continually occupy France and extract the 5 billion from the country. That's an important note about these negotiations. Much like in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, where Germany was still under blockade by the Royal Navy throughout negotiations, much of France was still under occupation by the German forces, while Bismarck and Thiers met. That forced Thiers to accept that 5 billion franc figure. With the Prussian army in occupation in much of France, there really wasn't much he could do. That heavy indemnity payment was a huge departure from historical norms. Usually, the reparation payment for the victorious power simply covered their war expenses. However, Bismarck and the new Germany were receiving well beyond just their war expenses to be covered. Some theorized at the time that because of this, countries would start to wage wars purely for monetary gains. German soldiers would end up occupying France until September of 1873, when the amount had been paid in full. So, to sum up, the three major provisions in the Treaty of Frankfurt, which was signed on May 10, 1871, were: number 1, the Alsace and Lorraine territories were ceded to Germany. 2, France would pay Germany 5 billion francs and be occupied until fully paid. And 3, Germany would have a victory march through Paris to really drive home that Germany was victorious and France had been defeated. These terms would come full circle after World War I, when France was able to reclaim Alsace and Lorraine. As well, they were a big pusher of a heavy war indemnity payment, and even occupied the Saar and Ruhr region to extract natural resources from Germany as part of the indemnity payment. And finally, France was also a big proponent of a treaty that would keep Germany weak, much like Bismarck attempted with them. His treaty was meant to keep France crippled for 30 to 50 years. That is why severe limitations to the German military and ceding of territory from Germany to create new countries, like Poland, were added as provisions to the Treaty of Versailles. The ghosts of the past were lurking in the background of the Treaty of Versailles. Could Germany or France have been more gracious in victory? Sure, but that's not how history goes. After great victories, it is really hard to then settle for less. Congrats! You have made it to the end of this beast of a video. When analyzing the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, it is really not hard to figure out why Prussia and its German allies won and France lost. The three main factors, in my opinion, that led to that were: number 1, mobilization. The Prussians effectively mobilized their massive force, while France squandered its early advantage in professional soldiers with a chaotic and inefficient mobilization process. Number 2, leadership. Moltke is a forgotten military genius. He effectively outmaneuvered the French into his famous pocket battles. He also created the conditions for his commanders to seize the initiative. On the French side, Napoleon III was overwhelmed, and his subordinate commanders preferred to sit on the defensive. That is why, time and again, Prussian soldiers ran towards the sounds of battle, while the French stayed static, doomed to be outflanked. And number 3, artillery. Honestly, in my opinion, this is the single most important factor as to why Prussia won. Anytime their infantry attack stalled, or a French counterattack was attempted, Prussian artillery, led by their Krupp guns, either blasted an opening for the infantry to exploit, or pulverized the French attack, pushing them back on the defensive. The French may have had the better rifle, but it mattered very little when their troops could be hit by artillery that was shooting from out of sight line, while their own artillery had no hope of countering that fire. Military observers at the time took a different analysis when looking at the Franco-Prussian War. What they saw was the folly of a defensive-oriented war, believing that sitting behind static defensive positions ruined morale, and that it was the duty of commanders to go on the offensive, utilizing the honorable and spirited charge to defeat the enemy. That would be heavily responsible for the awful casualty figures we would see in World War I, as the technology kept improving, but the military theories stayed rooted in the mid to late 1800s. As for the two powers, Germany and France, this war dramatically changed their trajectories. On the French side, they were surprisingly able to recover much quicker than most people expected, and made much needed reforms militarily and economically as part of the Third Republic. When World War I broke out in the summer of 1914, France would not be alone, allied with Great Britain and Russia, and would not be seen as the aggressor, as Germany had declared war first and invaded neutral Belgium to start the war with France. France had learned their lesson about going to war alone against Germany, and being the initiator of the conflict, hurting their global perception. On the German side, the state Bismarck created from war and compromises was awkward. The German Empire would give extraordinary powers to the Kaiser, or Emperor. He had the right to declare war without the consent of the Reichstag. He had complete control of the military and foreign policy, and the exclusive right to initiate policy. The Chancellor position, which Bismarck created for himself, was simply there to execute the will of the Kaiser. In fact, the Chancellor did not even report to the Reichstag. He answered to the Emperor alone. That setup had worked for Kaiser Wilhelm I and Bismarck, because the first Kaiser Wilhelm left diplomacy up to Bismarck and rarely interfered. That is why by the mid-1880s, Bismarck's foreign policy had expertly isolated their rival France. Germany had alliances with Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, along with cordial relations with Great Britain. That delicate system fell apart when the grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm rose to power in 1888, under the title Kaiser Wilhelm II. He didn't like Bismarck's power and control, and so he pushed out the legendary diplomat in 1890. From there, German foreign policy took a turn. In 1890, after dismissing Bismarck, the German-Russian treaty was not renewed. That led Russia to align itself with France. The worst move, though, was the battleship program. Wilhelm II was the grandson of Queen Victoria of England, and he was always jealous of Great Britain's status on the global stage. And so he looked to bring Germany to be more of an equal with the British. And that meant taking on more global responsibilities, like colonies. And to do that, he wanted to build up a strong navy. The dreadnought race that followed would antagonize the British until they eventually aligned themselves with the French and consequently the Russians, which caused Germany to feel surrounded by enemies. Germany had become a state by war and conquest. And so after the Franco-Prussian War, militarists were empowered. They linked Germany's health to war and expansion. That mentality, along with the rest of Europe's feeling of Germany as a colossal threat, would eventually plunge the world into the war to end all wars in 1914. Thank you to everybody who watched. I am really sorry if I pronounced anything wrong. I think I pronounced Chesapeake like 10 different times in 10 different ways. As well, some of my names might be a mess, and I'm sorry about that, and I'm working on it.